everybody. This lecture is about race and racism in cultural context. By now you've already been learning about the subject of race from the perspective of the other subfields. I'm going to talk about race and racism from the perspective of cultural anthropology. And I hope you'll see some overlap in what we talk about here, as well as some distinctions in terms of what the focus is of each of the three subfields. And how hopefully they sort of, when you bring them all together, they give you that more well-rounded, more holistic view of this very complex subject of race, racial categories, racial identities, and the fact of racism and inequities around race as they manifest in the United States and other places in the world. So that's sort of the set of topics that we're going to be talking about today. So I wanted to start with just a really sort of baseline concept in terms of how cultural anthropologists think and study and present ideas around race. And that's the basic idea that race is a socially constructed set of categories. We're going to talk more about what I mean by that along the course of this lecture. But the basic concept here is that race is not a biological phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon. And it's a way in which people in various places and at various moments in time have projected a set of distinctions onto human physical variation. So those categories are not rooted in nature or rooted in our biological variation. They are rooted in the cultures in which those categories arise, and then they are sort of thrust onto cultural variation and come to be something that people understand to be the way that people are organized into groups, etc., even as it's something that we can, if we step back from it and start studying it, as we're again going to talk about in this lecture, we can see the ways in which those categories are constructed, fabricated over time. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about. One of the key ways that we know that racial categories are constructed is by being able to see that they vary from place to place and that they change over time. Okay, so there's nothing really stable about race categories or racial identities. It's something that shifts. So we'll look in this lecture both at a sort of cross-cultural comparison between two places in the world, and also we'll look a little bit historically at how ideas about race have changed over time and where some of the assumptions about race in the United States come from. All right, so again, unpacking a little bit more this notion that that race categories are cultural constructions. If we back up a bit and just think about human variation more generally, and I know this is something that you've already been hearing about in the lecture and readings and film from the biological anthropology side, so I'm just going to dip into it a little bit before we talk more specifically about what cultural anthropologists work on. But if we think about human variation, one of the things we can notice right away is that only some of the traits are culturally elaborated. What I mean by that is there are all kinds of ways in which people vary physically, but not all of them become elaborated into a basis for social identity or socially recognized identity. So, for example, there are some forms of human variation. A good example is the one right here on the screen, which is fingerprints. Do in fact fall out into categories, but are never in fact attached to your personal identity. Everybody's fingerprints fall into one of three categories. You're either loops, whorls, or arches. But I'm going to guess that most of you don't even know which one your fingerprints correspond to. You could go look right now and figure it out. But the point is that this particular form of physical variation among humans is not one that has a lot of cultural meaning for us, right? People don't identify as a whorl and try to hang out with other whorls, for example. Lactose tolerance and intolerance is another good example, right? That is a form of variation among people. But again, it's not one that's culturally elaborated. We don't attach people's identities to that. So there are some forms of physical variation that are culturally elaborated. And one of the key ones as relates to race categories in the United States and elsewhere is skin color, right? So again, the point here is that it's arbitrary that skin color seems to have meaning as far as identity, and something like fingerprints or lactose tolerance does not, right? We could imagine another world in which fingerprints were how people self-identified, right? So it's arbitrary that we live in a world where skin color became that trait that has that cultural meaning in many societies. The second thing I want to point out about these, again, different sort of traits as far as human variation is that skin color, as well as many other elements of human variation, is what is considered a continuous trait. What that means is that, like height, for example, that is something that varies but does not fall out into discrete categories, right? So if you take, for example, the image on the top here, if you lined up all the people in the world from the shortest person to the tallest person, what you would have would be every tiny little gradation of height between the shortest and the tallest, right? So it would be incremental and continuous. There's no natural break between short people and medium people and tall people, right? That's a completely arbitrary distinction. We know that it's a continuum, right? Skin color is also a continuous trait. So as we see in the image on the bottom, there are no natural categories or breaks between lighter skin, medium skin, darker skin. Where we place those boundaries is arbitrary and cultural, right? So as soon as we see that a continuous trait is being formed into categories, we can see that there are cultural processes at work. Okay, so once we've started thinking a little bit about the difference between human biological variation and the ways that race categories and race identities are projected onto that variation, we can start to think about, well, how is it that we came to a point where those categories have such power? How do they come to be formulated as they are, right? If they're not rooted in biology, they're rooted in human culture and history. So what are the historical events and movements and moments that have contributed to where we've ended up, particularly in the US, since that's where we are right now and that's where we want to focus. So I want to talk now about just a few, what I'm calling the antecedents to contemporary American race concepts. By antecedent, I just mean some things that came before, earlier in history, that have continued to resonate and inform how people in the present day think about and act on questions of race, okay? One of the places we would need to start, because it's so foundational, is European colonialism. So as I'm sure you probably have learned about European colonization of the rest of the world, either in your high school history classes or maybe in some of the classes you've taken here at Northeastern so far, that starting in the 16th century, European nations set out to travel to various other parts of the globe. And often the people they encountered there, they engaged in relationships that led to the colonization of those regions, meaning that European nations set up some kind of political presence and engaged in economic activities that often involved the exploitation of local resources, including natural resources and human resources, for the enrichment of the European nations back home. So these sort of controlling and exploitative relationships led to the map that you see here, where if you look at the key on the left there, you can see which European nation colonized which of these other parts of the world, right? So much of the world system from the 16th to the 20th centuries was organized around the dominance of European colonial powers in much of the rest of the world. So again, if we want to start thinking about how does that long historical process of European colonialism lead to or inform contemporary American race concepts, we can think about the process of colonization itself. And part of it is the European nations who were engaging in this kind of political economic behavior, um, among other things, right, among the sort of things they needed to address, one certainly was some kind of justification. There's not a lot of justification for going to another part of the world, claiming someone else's land, killing the people of that area in large numbers, taking control of their resources and exporting them to your home country. So one of the ways that it was justified was through a narrative of a hierarchy of civilizations. Many of the European colonizers asserted that there were more civilized and less civilized societies or populations of people, and that the sort of lesser status of the people in the lands they were visiting justified this kind of behavior, this sort of exploitative relationship that they entered into. Clearly that's not justifiable, and that's not actually what was going on there. But this idea that there is a sort of hierarchy of civilizations, and that relative worth and relative power is distributed based on that hierarchy, was a very powerful set of notions that, again, has had a real effect on the world from that moment in the past and into the present. Related to European colonization, or a part of European colonization, was, of course, the transatlantic slave trade, which took place from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and which involved the movement of African people who were enslaved by European colonizers and exported to the Americas to be laborers, often building the wealth of both individuals and countries in the Americas. Certainly the basis of the United States of America is largely in that slave labor, the plantations, and other kinds of sort of profitable entities that were used to build that early part of the colonial United States, but elsewhere in the Americas as well. The slave trade, which again was a sort of deeply violent, dehumanizing, and exploitative set of practices that lasted for centuries, again, which rested on the justification that some people were less worthy and less civilized than others. As untrue as that narrative is, had a lasting influence on how people are viewed, including how people and how different racial identities are viewed in the contemporary United States. So this is another one of those antecedents to contemporary race concepts that we need to understand. Even after the end of the slave trade and the abolishing of slavery in the United States, the 20th century saw continuing racialized and racist ideologies and practices that are other antecedents to race categories in the United States that need to be noted. The eugenics movement, which was a movement in both the US and Europe from the late 19th century well into the 20th century, was another sort of pseudo-scientific comparative movement that asserted a hierarchy of relative worth of different populations. And that ideology also influenced various policies enacted within the United States. For example, the racial segregation laws that were in place in much of the United States from the late 19th century into the 1960s, where different kinds of facilities and social services were segregated by race identity. So again, this history going back centuries that would divide people into these sort of racialized categories with the notion that some categories of people are inherently more worthy, more advanced, more civilized than others, more deserving of political and economic power, etc., had a long-standing influence in American society and continue to inform ideas about race today. So I wanted to sort of shift a little bit now to where anthropology comes into all of this, and particularly where cultural anthropology comes into all of this. And one figure to begin with to talk about that is a cultural anthropologist named Franz Boas. He is by many considered to be the founder of modern American anthropology. He was a cultural anthropologist who did a lot of field research, particularly with Native American groups in the United States. And he was one of the sort of first modern anthropologists, right, actual researcher anthropologists, to really challenge biological explanations for human behavior and for human differences. And he was indeed one of the anthropologists who first developed the notion of cultural relativism. That is, that all populations of people, all societies, all cultures are equally complex, worthy of our attention, worthy of dignity and respect. Again, working in the era that he did at the turn of the 20th century, Boas's ideas were quite radical. But his approach to cross-cultural study and to sort of human variation and the idea of cultural relativism have continued to have long-standing influence within the field of anthropology. So even in the sort of modern era, you can see, for example, in the Statement on Race by the American Anthropological Association, which is the sort of major professional organization for anthropologists in the United States, part of that Statement on Race reads, "Physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them." So again, this idea that cultural differences, including those around race and ethnicity, are cultural constructions and do not indicate something to do with value or civilization or advancement, was part of the agenda of Franz Boas and the other cultural anthropologists who came after him. So he's an important sort of figure in terms of laying the groundwork early in the field of anthropology for what the ethos of the field would be around these questions of difference. Okay, so let's sort of think in a more contemporary context then about differences in ideas about race and how ideas about race shift over time. I've stressed to now that race is not a biological concept, that is a culturally constructed set of categories. But I want to also make it clear that what I'm saying here is not that race is not something that exists, right? Or that it's something we don't need to think about. Because it does exist in the sense that ideas about race, categories associated with race, identities associated with race are really powerful and influence people's lives on a daily basis. But the distinction I'm trying to make here is that those powerful categories and experiences and identities are social phenomena, not biological ones. So we need to address them for what they are, right? So we do need to think about how race is enacted in the United States, but we need to understand that the lens to use for that is a sociocultural lens and not a biological lens, if we really want to understand what's going on. We can see that race categories are constructed when we compare both how they change over time, historically, and how they vary across space, meaning when we do a cross-cultural comparison. So I want to give you an example of each of those, just to demonstrate, again, those kinds of variations. The U.S. Census is an interesting place to look, to think about how racial and ethnic categories change over time. You're probably familiar with the census. We just filled one out fairly recently. It's every 10 years. And the U.S. government has been pretty consistent with doing this sort of survey of who lives in the U.S. every 10 years for a long time, right? since the beginning of the census, there's always been questions about the race and ethnicity of the respondents to the census. So one interesting thing we can do to sort of understand how categories connected to these identities change over time is to look back at the categories that are included on the census form. If you filled out a census form before, or you looked at one, you've probably noticed that there's usually a bunch of categories that you can check, right? And sometimes you can write something in, but it's always sort of trying to get at people's heritage or identity, right? So these are some examples from those census questions about race and ethnicity over time. Starting in the 1880s, I have a sort of several sessions of the census. I didn't put every single one on here, but sort of periodic information from the census forms over time. And what you can see is that the nature of the categories and the number of categories change over time. And some of these categories are ones that we no longer recognize, that mean nothing to us from the vantage of, of the 2020s, right, of 2022. Others we might think of more as ethnicity versus race, etc. So the point is not that any of these categories is more correct or more accurate than any other, but that the fact that they shift over time, and that these were the categories that made sense to people in that moment and no longer make sense to us, should be a real flag to us to say, oh, clearly there's nothing essential about these categories. These are categories that are constructed in a moment of time and reflect the social and cultural dynamics of that moment. So these are the historical ones, and this is the modern form, right? One of the things that's also interesting to look at as the census form sort of shifts over time is to what extent people are able to choose to self-identify in more nuanced ways. So, for example, the instructions for these questions on the earlier forms used to be pick one, right? So you really had to put yourself in one of the boxes. This modern form, now the instructions are mark one or more boxes. So, in fact, there is a bit more nuance in how people can self-identify. One of the things you read, the article by Fish, also helps us try to understand the constructedness of race categories. And it does so by comparing race categories in the US versus in the country of Brazil in South America. So what we get from this article is sort of culturally specific models of race. And what you see from Fish's comparison is that the categories utilized in the United States are more fixed, that is, they're less changeable over time in the life of a person, and also that they're more based on concepts of heritage or who your parents were, right? Whereas the categories utilized in Brazil are more flexible and they're more focused on appearance, what somebody looks like, regardless of who their parents may have been, right? So the two models, right, the two culturally specific models of race that Fish describes, for the U.S., he refers to it as the concept of hypodescent. And for the Brazilian case, he refers to it as tipos, right, or types. So the U.S. concept of hypodescent, what that means, and again, this is not to say that this has any sort of truth to it, right, in the sense of being some kind of neutral fact, but it's the notion of hypodescent is a cultural model, right? So the logic of it is something that's specific to a particular cultural world. So the notion of hypodescent is that somebody whose parents come from different racial or ethnic groups, the child will be categorized with the identity of the parent, the identity that is of lower status. Okay, hypodescent. So, for example, in the United States, typically somebody who has one parent who's identified as white and one parent who's identified as African American, the child of those parents will be categorized as African American, right? That's the rule of hypodescent, or the logic of hypodescent, which, again, doesn't particularly make any sense, right? It only makes sense in that cultural world where there's that understanding of what heritage and race mean, right? In contrast, what Fish finds when looking into these Brazilian tipos is that people in Brazil are described in terms of their sort of racial identity, are described much more in terms of what they look like, not necessarily who their parents are. So in other words, children of the same set of parents, of the same two parents, may be described as having different racial identities, right? If one has lighter skin or one has darker skin. So it's not about who you came from as much as what you look like. And then even that description is often a little bit flexible. So you might be described in different ways on different days or by different people, right? So it's a more flexible, a more fluid notion of racial identity. Now, that said, there's lots of evidence from all the researchers who work in Brazil that there's still racism evident in Brazilian society. And that particularly people of African descent in Brazil often find themselves economically and politically disadvantaged. So it's not that it's sort of utopia, right? Where because race categories are flexible, it means, everybody's considered to be equal. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So the ways that racism plays out are different than the ways it plays out in the United States, but there are still those inequities based on identity tied to appearance and ideas about race. So the thing I want to end on then is the second thing that you read, which is Garth's article, which really is about how race and racism manifest in the United States, particularly in the very recent era, the last few years. So this is a really sort of recent article that's analyzing both responses to police violence in the United States, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests around police violence that we saw starting in 2020 and thereafter, and the COVID pandemic, right? And particularly the health disparities that are playing out around COVID. So in both cases, we see that police violence and COVID do not equally affect all people in the United States. Police violence is much more likely to affect African Americans and other people of color. And likewise, the people who are most affected, who are most likely to both get and die from COVID, are people from those particular social groups. So it is not a sort of equally distributed mortality. Some of the reasons for that are other kinds of social inequities. So it's not just COVID that Garth wants to talk about, right? It's more that COVID and the protests in recent years are revealing something that has deep roots, right? So the inequities that are revealed by COVID are not just of this moment. Those inequities didn't start in 2020. It's more that these sort of generations of inequities then play out in terms of who gets and who dies from COVID, right? So African American and Latinx people are much more likely to serve in positions that, for example, did not allow them to go into lockdown. They had to stay on the front lines during the sort of worst moments of the pandemic. And therefore were more likely to be exposed to the virus in the first place. And then also less likely to have the sort of healthcare, testing, etc., access to those resources than others. So more likely to not get sufficient treatment, hospitalization, etc. So if you look at the mortality numbers, they're quite stark, right? The likelihood of dying of COVID goes up precipitously if you are African American or Latinx. So again, Garth is not saying this is a phenomenon that is, born of 2020, but more that COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protests are revealing something that is long-standing in our society. one of the key concepts that Garth uses to describe that sort of foundation of inequity is a concept called racial capitalism. And Garth cites the sort of the original author of that notion of racial capitalism, Cedric Robinson. You can go ahead and read more about that if you're interested in it. But the concept of racial capitalism is that the historical development of capitalism, so sort of our modern political economic system as it exists in the US and the world more generally, was developed based on racist hierarchies. Think back to what we were talking about European colonization, right? The way the world was reordered in that moment, right, was along the lines not only of certain kinds of political and economic domination, but also along the idea of sort of white supremacy and a sort of racist ideology about more worthy and less worthy categories of people. So the idea of this concept, then, of Robinson's concept, is that sort of racist ideology and those hierarchies were baked into capitalism, right? So in other words, our contemporary society still reflects those ideologies in all kinds of ways. And those inequities that are in sort of every aspect of society have led to things like, ultimately, the uprisings around the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the inequities around COVID. So the idea here is that Garth is using those specific, very recent events and moments as a lens to sort of reveal this much broader set of social disparities and the ways that those are continued through the structures of our society. So again, this is one way to think about how race plays out and how racism plays out through the various channels and the ways that people experience their daily lives, as well as really momentous events like a 100-year pandemic. Okay, well, we'll stop there. And again, I hope you can find ways to connect what we've talked about here with what you're learning in the other two parts of this unit for a sort of more holistic view of race in the United States and thinking about how it manifests in individual lives and across societies more generally. So we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.